It was one of those cold, rainy mornings that made the whole city look grey and sleepy. The streets outside were wet, and the sound of raindrops hitting glass echoed inside the tall glass building that belonged to one of the richest men in the city, Mr. Richard Moore. Richard was not only known for his money, but also for his pride. He liked being noticed. He liked when people looked at him with respect or even fear. He walked into his company's lobby that morning, wearing a dark blue suit, holding a golden chess set in his hand. The gold pieces gleamed under the lights, shining like treasure. Everyone knew Richard never went anywhere without it. To him, the chessboard was not just a game, it was a symbol of intelligence and power. He often told people that life itself was like chess, only the smart win. His employees had heard him say that 100 times before, so when they saw him walking proudly through the lobby, with that same golden box under his arm, they knew he was about to show off again. At the far end of the lobby, a janitor named Mr. Carter was quietly mopping the marble floor. He was an older man, humble and silent, who never caused any trouble. He had worked in that company for years, but few people even knew his name. Near him sat a young boy, maybe 12 years old, wearing a simple grey shirt that was a bit too big for him. His shoes were worn out, and his backpack looked old, but his eyes were bright and curious. The boy's name was Ethan Carter, Mr. Carter's son. The janitor had brought him along that morning because his wife was sick, and there was no one else to watch over Ethan. The boy sat quietly, waiting for his father to finish his shift, but his attention was caught by something shining in Richard's hand, the golden chess set. Richard noticed the boy staring and stopped. He smirked, enjoying the attention. "You like this, kid?" he asked, raising the box slightly. The boy nodded shyly. Richard laughed, his voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "Do you even know what this is?" he asked, his tone playful but mocking. The janitor looked up nervously, unsure if he should interrupt. Before he could say anything, the boy spoke softly. "Yes, sir. It's a game of logic." Richard raised an eyebrow, amused. "Logic?" he repeated, his smile widening. "From a janitor's kid." The people in the lobby, the receptionist, a few assistants, even the security guard, looked at each other, trying not to laugh. They all knew how Richard liked to tease people he thought were beneath him, but the boy didn't look embarrassed. He just sat there, calm and polite, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His voice was quiet but steady. "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "It's not about money or luck. It's about thinking ahead." For a moment, Richard froze. The boy's words surprised him. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by a child, and definitely not by a janitor's son. He could feel some of the workers watching, waiting to see what he would say next. So he chuckled again, louder this time, and said, "Well, little genius, maybe you can teach me how to think ahead then." The boy smiled slightly, unsure if he was serious. But Richard wasn't finished. He leaned closer and said, "Tell you what, why don't we play a game? Right here, right now." Mr. Carter stopped mopping. "Sir, please," he said quietly. "He's just a kid." But Richard waved his hand. "Relax, Carter. It's just a friendly match." His voice carried a hint of mockery. He loved an audience, and now everyone in the lobby had stopped working to watch. The boy looked at his father, who hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It's all right, Ethan," he said softly. "Just be respectful." Ethan nodded back. He didn't seem nervous. He stood up, small and quiet, and followed Richard to a nearby table made of polished wood. Richard opened his golden chess set carefully, setting up the shiny pieces one by one. Each piece gleamed under the lobby lights. People whispered among themselves, curious about what would happen. No one really believed the boy could last more than a few minutes against Richard, who had won many local tournaments and loved to boast about his victories. As the pieces were arranged, Richard looked at Ethan and smiled confidently. "I'll go easy on you, all right?" he said. Ethan said nothing. He only watched the board, his eyes sharp and focused. Richard made the first move, tapping his golden pawn forward. "Your turn," he said proudly. Ethan leaned forward, studying the board for a few seconds before moving his pawn too. The janitor stood nearby, holding his mop tightly, worried but curious. The game had just begun, but something about the boy's calm movements made a few people whisper. Richard kept playing, throwing in jokes and comments. "You sure you know what you're doing?" he teased. Maybe you should stick to checkers. But Ethan didn't react. He just kept playing, silent and patient. After a few moves, Richard frowned slightly. The boy's moves weren't random. They were calculated. Ethan was not just playing for fun. He was planning something. Richard moved another piece, but Ethan immediately responded with a move that caught his attention. "Interesting," Richard muttered. The lobby was completely quiet now. Even the receptionist stopped typing. Everyone watched as the boy played each move with quiet confidence. "You're pretty quick," Richard said, trying to sound amused. But his smile had started to fade just a little. Ethan looked up and said softly, "It's about thinking ahead, remember?" Richard paused. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. The boy's words echoed in his mind. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was in control of this little game. He forced a laugh and leaned back in his chair, trying to look relaxed. "Well then," he said, "let's see how far ahead you can think." The next few moves came faster. Ethan's hands moved smoothly, confidently. The boy didn't even seem to hesitate. When he placed his knight in front of Richard's queen, Richard suddenly realized he was in trouble. He blinked and leaned closer to the board. "Wait," he said quietly. "That can't be right." But it was. Ethan looked at him and said politely, "You might lose your queen, sir." For a moment, the millionaire froze. The room went completely silent. His employees stared wide-eyed. The janitor looked shocked. No one spoke a word. Richard's fingers twitched slightly as he tried to find a move that would save him. He couldn't. Slowly, he looked up at the boy who was sitting still, waiting for him to play. The millionaire forced a smile, but his face had turned pale. "Well," he said quietly, "this just got interesting." And no one in that lobby, not even Richard himself, had any idea that this simple, rainy morning would soon become the most unforgettable day of his life. The whole office was still whispering about what had happened that morning. Nobody could believe that a small boy had almost cornered the proud millionaire in a chess game. Mr. Richard Moore tried to laugh it off, saying it was just luck. But deep inside, something about the boy's calm confidence kept echoing in his mind. The way Ethan looked at the board, the quiet focus in his eyes, the small polite smile, it all felt different. He wasn't like other kids. There was something sharp about him, something that even Richard couldn't quite understand. After the game ended, Richard had been saved by a phone call before the boy could finish, but everyone in the lobby knew who had the upper hand. When the janitor and his son left, the silence in the room stayed behind. That silence bothered Richard for hours. He couldn't focus on his work. He kept remembering the way Ethan had said, "It's about thinking ahead." No one had ever said something that simple yet powerful to him before. Richard was used to people agreeing with everything he said, afraid to challenge him. But that boy had said it calmly, without fear, and it hit something inside him he didn't expect. Later that evening, as Richard sat in his office looking out at the rainy city through his large glass window, he opened his golden chess set again. He started replaying the moves in his mind, trying to figure out what he missed. It made him feel uneasy. How could a janitor's son play like that? He told himself maybe the boy was lucky. Maybe it was all coincidence, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. That boy knew exactly what he was doing, Ethan. On the other hand, walked home with his father through the wet streets, holding his old backpack close. He didn't say much. His father finally asked, "Son, where did you learn to play like that?" Ethan smiled a little. "From books, Dad. The library near the park has a chess section. I've been reading those for months." Mr. Carter was surprised. He had always known his son was smart, but he didn't realize just how much time Ethan spent studying alone. Every evening after school, while other kids played outside, Ethan sat at a small wooden table in their tiny apartment, drawing chessboards on paper, replaying old grandmaster games he found in books. They didn't have a computer, no internet, and certainly no chess set at home, so Ethan had learned everything using imagination and patience. His mother often watched him, proud and worried. At the same time, she knew her son had something special, but she also knew life was not easy for people like them. They couldn't afford tutors, tournaments, or training. All they had was hope. The next day, when Mr. Carter came to work, some employees teased him kindly. "How your kid almost beat the boss," one said. Mr. Carter smiled shyly but didn't respond much. He was proud but cautious. He didn't want trouble. He had seen how quickly rich people's moods could change. But to his surprise, around noon, Richard himself came down to the lobby. He looked around and said, "Where's your boy?" Mr. Carter froze for a moment. "He's at school, sir," he answered nervously. Richard nodded, looking thoughtful. "Tell him to come with you tomorrow. I want to play again." The janitor didn't know what to say. "Sir, I'm not sure if—" "It's fine," Richard interrupted. "I insist." He walked away before Carter could refuse. That evening, when Mr. Carter told Ethan, the boy smiled quietly. "He wants to play again?" Ethan asked. "Yes," his father said. "But son, please be careful." "Don't make him angry." Ethan nodded. "I'll try my best." He didn't seem scared. The next morning, Ethan walked into the company lobby again, wearing the same old shirt but with a spark of excitement in his eyes. This time, even more people had gathered. The word had spread. The millionaire and the janitor's son were going to play again. Richard sat confidently at the table, the golden chess set ready. But this time he didn't laugh. His face was serious. "You ready, kid?" he asked. Ethan nodded politely. "Yes, sir." Richard smiled slightly. "Let's make this interesting. If you win, I'll give you something special." The boy looked curious. "And if I lose?" "Then you'll clean my board every week for a month," Richard said jokingly. The crowd laughed. Ethan didn't. He only said, "Deal." The game began. Richard started strong, moving fast, testing the boy. Ethan stayed calm, watching the board carefully. The millionaire made risky moves, trying to confuse him, but the boy saw through every trick. Piece by piece, Ethan built his position, slow but steady. Richard began to sweat. He leaned closer, focusing harder. For a man who always won, losing was not something he could accept easily. But as the game went on, the truth became clear. Ethan was better. He wasn't just lucky. He had real skill. Richard felt it, and so did everyone watching. The tension in the room grew with every move. After 20 minutes, Ethan made a move that forced Richard into a corner. The board was almost lost. Richard stared at it in disbelief. "How?" he whispered. Ethan looked up and said softly, "Sometimes the smallest move changes everything." It was not meant to sound clever. It was just something Ethan believed. But to Richard it felt like a lesson. He realized this boy wasn't trying to humiliate him. He was just playing with pure focus, no pride, no ego, just passion. When the game ended, Richard sat quietly staring at the board. He didn't speak for a long time. The room stayed silent. Finally, he looked at Ethan and said, "You're something else, kid." Ethan smiled shyly and said, "Thank you, sir." Richard nodded slowly. "I mean it." Then he stood up and said, "Come to my office tomorrow. I want to talk." Everyone in the room looked surprised. Mr. Carter didn't understand what the millionaire wanted, but something in Richard's tone was different. It wasn't mockery anymore, it was respect. For the first time in years, the proud millionaire had found someone who made him see the world differently. And that someone was the janitor's son. The next morning came with bright sunlight after 2 days of rain. The city seemed fresher, the air cleaner, as if something new was beginning. Inside Moore Industries, everyone was buzzing with curiosity. The story of the janitor's son who almost beat the boss had spread across departments. Some people whispered about how bold the boy was, while others admired his calmness. Mr. Richard Moore himself had not stopped thinking about Ethan, the millionaire, who once saw life like a chessboard, filled only with his own victories, now found himself haunted by the image of a boy who had quietly outsmarted him. That day, Richard arrived early, earlier than anyone expected. He had arranged a special table in his private office and even asked the janitor to bring Ethan after school. When Mr. Carter arrived with his son later that afternoon, both were nervous. The receptionist guided them upstairs, something that had never happened before. The janitor had worked there for years, but had never stepped inside the boss's grand office. The elevator doors opened to reveal a huge room filled with glass walls, expensive furniture, and a wide city view. The sunlight hit the golden chess set, sitting at the center of a long wooden table. Richard stood near the window, looking thoughtful. When he turned around, he smiled politely. "Welcome, Mr. Carter. And you, young man, I've been waiting for you." Ethan smiled shyly and said, "Good afternoon, sir." Richard gestured toward the table. "Let's continue our unfinished match, shall we?" The boy nodded. They both sat down. This time there was no audience, no laughter, no teasing. Only silence and respect. Richard looked at the boy across the board. "You surprised me last time," he said calmly. "You play with focus, and that's rare." Ethan replied softly, "I like the game, sir. It teaches patience." Richard chuckled. "Patience, huh? That's something even I'm still learning." He moved his first pawn forward and the game began. At first, Richard played carefully, not rushing his moves. Ethan studied each piece with intense concentration. The sound of the clock ticking filled the room. The millionaire was known for his strategic mind in business, but this game was different. He wasn't thinking about winning deals or showing off his power. For the first time in years, he was just thinking, really thinking. Every move from the boy forced him to reconsider his plan. Ethan played differently this time, more boldly, more confident. He moved his pieces like someone who could see the future 10 steps ahead. Richard noticed that and smiled. "You've been practicing," he said. "A little," Ethan replied. "I play with the school librarian sometimes when she's free." Richard leaned back in his chair, impressed. The janitor stood quietly in the corner, not daring to move, his heart pounding with pride. Half an hour passed. The game grew more intense. Richard's brow furrowed as he leaned closer to the board. Ethan had trapped one of his rooks. The older man made a move, but the boy countered instantly. So it wasn't luck, it was skill. Richard began to realize that every move Ethan made had a purpose. He wasn't playing randomly. He was constructing something slowly, silently, waiting for the right moment. "You see the whole board differently, don't you?" Richard asked. Ethan nodded. "I try to look from both sides, sir. Not just mine." That sentence hit Richard deeply. In his world of wealth and business, he had always played for himself. He had never thought about what the other side saw or felt. For a few seconds he just stared at the boy, lost in thought. Then Ethan moved his knight, and suddenly Richard's queen was trapped again. The millionaire gasped softly. He hadn't seen it coming. "Check," Ethan said quietly. Richard blinked in surprise, then smiled slowly. "You're even better than last time." He escaped the check, but barely. The game went on for another 20 minutes. Richard was sweating now, not from fear, but from pure concentration. His respect for Ethan grew with every passing move. The boy was humble, focused, and completely absorbed in the game. No ego, no arrogance, no hesitation, just clarity. The janitor couldn't believe what he was seeing. His son was sitting face to face with a millionaire, and yet it looked like they were equals. No, not equals. Ethan was leading. Richard moved his bishop, trying to block a checkmate, but Ethan moved his queen swiftly. The older man froze. The position was beautiful, precise, and deadly. He looked at the board and whispered, "You've got me again, haven't you?" Ethan looked down respectfully and said, "Checkmate, sir." Silence filled the room. Richard leaned back in his chair and let out a deep breath. Then, instead of frustration or anger, he began to laugh softly. It wasn't a mocking laugh, it was genuine. "You really are something special," he said. "You don't just play the game. You understand it." The boy smiled. "Thank you, sir." Richard stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. "Do you know why I love chess?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. "Because it reminds me of life. Every move matters. But maybe I've been seeing it wrong all this time. Maybe it's not about crushing the other side. Maybe it's about seeing the whole picture." He turned back toward the boy, his voice softer now. "You've taught me that today." Mr. Carter stood speechless, watching this change in his boss. Richard looked at him and said, "You've raised an incredible son." The janitor's eyes filled with tears. He didn't know what to say. Richard then placed one of the golden chess pieces, the knight, in Ethan's hand. "Keep this," he said. "It's a reminder that true talent doesn't come from money. It comes from here." He pointed to his head, then to his heart. Ethan held the piece carefully, almost afraid to touch it. "Thank you, sir," he said softly. Richard smiled warmly. "No, thank you." The sun outside had turned orange now, painting the office in golden light. The game was over, but something much greater had started. Their bond of respect had formed between two worlds, one of wealth and one of hard work, connected by a chessboard and a boy's quiet brilliance. And though Richard didn't know it yet, that small act of kindness would change not just Ethan's life, but his own forever. Days turned into weeks after that unforgettable match in Mr. Moore's office, but the memory stayed fresh in everyone's mind. The janitor's son defeating the millionaire had become the quiet legend of the building. Workers whispered about it when Richard wasn't around, amazed that the proud man had not fired anyone or shown anger. In fact, something had changed in him. He had stopped showing off his golden chess set in meetings. He had stopped mocking others or talking about winning all the time. Instead, he had become calmer, quieter, almost thoughtful. No one could understand it, but Richard himself knew why. That young boy, Ethan, had opened his eyes. He saw in Ethan something pure. Not greed, not pride, just love for the game and the will to learn. It made him realize how empty his own victories had been. One evening, as the city lights glowed against the night sky, Richard sat in his office looking at the golden knight that was missing from his set, the one he had given Ethan. He smiled softly, thinking about the boy's calm eyes and quiet words. Sometimes the smallest move changes everything. That line kept replaying in his head. It wasn't just about chess anymore. It was about life. Suddenly an idea came to him. He pressed a button on his desk and called his assistant. "Find out which school that boy goes to." The next morning, his car stopped outside a small public school at the edge of the city. It was old, with fading paint and broken fences. The millionaire looked out the window and saw children playing with worn-out soccer balls. When he stepped out of the car, everyone stared. Teachers whispered to each other, wondering why such a rich man was there. Richard walked into the principal's office and introduced himself. Within minutes, he was sitting across from Ethan and his father. The janitor looked nervous, unsure what the visit meant. Ethan sat beside him, confused but calm. Richard smiled kindly. "I've been thinking about our game," he began. "You have a gift, Ethan, a very rare one." The boy didn't know what to say, so he just listened. "I want to help you," Richard continued. "If you're willing to learn, I can get you proper training. Real chess coaching, tournaments, everything you deserve." Mr. Carter's eyes widened. "Sir, that's too much. We can't accept—" "It's not charity," Richard interrupted gently. "It's an investment. This boy could become something great." Ethan looked up and said softly, "Thank you, sir, but why would you do that for me?" Richard smiled sadly. "Because I once forgot what it meant to play with heart. You reminded me." The words were simple, but they came from a place of truth. Mr. Carter nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. "If this is what you want, son, then go for it." Ethan nodded, still speechless. From that day, everything began to change. Richard arranged for Ethan to train with a top chess coach in the city. He paid for his lessons, bought him books, and made sure he had a real chess set, not golden, but made of polished wood, elegant and simple. Every evening after school, Ethan studied and practiced. His natural talent grew sharper. He started entering small tournaments, often winning against players twice his age. Richard attended many of his matches quietly, sitting in the back of the room so no one would notice him. He didn't want credit. He just wanted to see the boy's light shine. But success, as always, came with challenges. In one of the tournaments, an arrogant player named Dylan, the son of another wealthy businessman, began mocking Ethan. "So you're the janitor's kid everyone talks about?" He sneered. "Let's see if you can actually play or if it was just luck." Ethan didn't respond. He sat calmly, just like he did with Richard the first time. The crowd watched eagerly as the two boys faced off. Dylan started aggressively, trying to crush Ethan early. But Ethan stayed cool, thinking ahead, just as always. Move after move, Dylan's confidence began to crack. His attacks failed. His pieces got trapped. And within minutes, Ethan turned the game completely around. "Checkmate," he said softly, echoing the same tone he had used years ago in the company lobby. The audience erupted in applause. Dylan slammed his hand on the table and stormed out, humiliated. Reporters who were covering the event started asking questions about the mysterious boy who defeated another rich man's son. When they found out about his background, the story spread quickly. "Janitor's son defeats millionaire's son in chess tournament." It made headlines online. Richard saw the article and smiled. He was proud but also emotional. The story reminded him of himself, only this time the lesson wasn't his to learn but someone else's. The next day Richard called Ethan to his office again. The boy walked in wearing his school uniform, carrying his wooden chess set. "Ryu made the news," Richard said with a grin. Ethan blushed. "I didn't mean to, sir." No, Richard said. "You earned it." He leaned back in his chair and added, "You know, Ethan, life is funny. I used to think money could buy intelligence. But you proved me wrong. Ethan looked at him and said quietly, "Maybe everyone's smart in their own way, sir. They just need a chance." That single line hit Richard's heart. He realized that his wealth could be used for something greater than himself. That night, he made a decision that would change many lives. He started a scholarship program for underprivileged children who showed talent in chess, naming it the Ethan Carter Initiative. The news spread across the city. When Ethan heard about it, he was speechless. He looked at his father, who said proudly, "See, son, even rich men can learn from good hearts." The millionaire who once laughed at a janitor's son now stood behind hundreds of young dreamers, giving them the chance he once mocked. And while the world saw Richard as a hero, he knew the truth. He was only returning the lesson that a humble boy had taught him across a chessboard on a rainy morning. Weeks passed after the scholarship announcement, and the city began to see Mr. Richard Moore in a different light. The once proud millionaire, known for his arrogance and ego, had changed completely. He now spent his mornings visiting schools, meeting children and watching them play chess. Reporters often followed him, taking pictures, asking questions, but he never took full credit for the change. Whenever someone asked why he started the program, he always said the same thing: "Because one boy showed me what real intelligence looks like." That boy was Ethan Carter. Ethan's life had changed too, but not in the way people might think. He didn't act like a celebrity or show off his new opportunities. He stayed humble, still helping his father at the company on weekends, still visiting the same library where his journey began. His mother's health had improved because of Richard's quiet support, and for the first time, their little apartment felt full of hope instead of worry. But deep inside Ethan's heart, something else was growing, a sense of responsibility. He realized that the game of chess wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It was about teaching, sharing, and inspiring others who had dreams but no resources. He started helping other kids at his school learn the game, showing them simple tactics, teaching them patience. They called him Coach Ethan, even though he was just 13. Richard noticed that and smiled proudly every time he visited. One afternoon, Richard invited Ethan and his father to his home for dinner. It was a large mansion at the edge of the city, filled with paintings, marble floors, and quiet hallways. Mr. Carter looked uncomfortable at first, feeling out of place, but Richard greeted them warmly, treating them like family. During dinner, Richard said, "Ethan, you've given me something no one else ever has, purpose." Ethan looked up, surprised. "Purpose, sir?" Richard nodded. "I spent my life chasing money and respect. I thought power made me important, but the truth is I was just playing to win, not to live. When I lost to you, I didn't lose the game. I found myself." Mr. Carter smiled softly, proud of both men sitting across the table. The conversation grew deeper. Richard asked Ethan about his dreams, and the boy said, "I want to become a chess grandmaster. But more than that, I want to teach kids who can't afford coaches like me." Those words hit Richard hard. He saw in Ethan something he had never seen before, a vision not for himself but for others. After dinner, Richard took them to his study where his golden chess set rested on a glass shelf. "Do you remember this?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. The day everything started." Richard opened the box and smiled. "This chess set has been with me for 20 years. It was my first symbol of success, but now it feels incomplete." He pointed to the missing knight, the piece he had given Ethan months ago. "Maybe that's how it's meant to be. You took the missing part and made it mean something." The boy looked at him quietly, not knowing what to say. Then Richard said something unexpected. "Ethan, I want you to represent my foundation in the National Chess League. I'll sponsor your training, travel, and every tournament. But only if you promise me one thing. When you win, you'll use that victory to lift others." Ethan's eyes widened. "I promise, sir," he said firmly. Richard smiled. "Good, then it's settled." From that moment, their bond grew even stronger. Richard became like a mentor, sometimes even a second father. He taught Ethan not just about chess, but about life, discipline, and humility. And in return, Ethan reminded Richard every day what kindness and purpose really meant. Months later, during one of Ethan's national qualifying tournaments, Richard sat in the front row watching nervously. Months passed after Ethan's big win, and life began to change for both him and Mr. Richard Moore in ways they never imagined. The Scholarship Foundation grew fast, attracting attention from schools, media, and even the government. Hundreds of children from poor families were now learning chess, competing and discovering their talents. Richard often attended those events, watching the kids laugh and play, remembering how it all started with one small boy and a single game. But behind the success, something quietly troubled him. Despite his joy, he felt a strange emptiness inside, not because of regret, but because he realized how many years he had wasted chasing money instead of meaning. One morning, he sat alone in his office, staring at a photo on his desk, a picture of Ethan holding a trophy, smiling brightly. Next to it was a younger picture of himself, proud and cold, taken years ago when he had just become a millionaire. He looked between the two faces and whispered, "I wish I had met him sooner." That day, Richard decided to make one more change in his life. He called Ethan and said, "I want to show you something important." Ethan agreed, curious as always. That evening, Richard drove Ethan and his father to a part of the city he hadn't visited in years, the old neighborhood where he grew up poor and forgotten. The buildings were broken, the roads cracked, and the air filled with memories of struggle. Richard parked his car and stepped out, saying softly, "This is where I came from." Mr. Carter and Ethan looked around, surprised. "I was just like you once," Richard continued. "My father was a factory worker. He used to fix machines all day, and my mother cleaned houses. I hated being poor, so I promised myself I'd never be like them. I thought money was the only way to be free. But now I know it made me a prisoner." Ethan listened carefully. Richard continued, "You and your father taught me something my parents tried to, but I never understood, that respect isn't about wealth, it's about worth." The three of them stood silently for a moment as the sun set behind the broken rooftops. Then Richard turned and said, "I'm going to build something here, a free learning center, a place where kids can study, learn chess and find their passion. It'll be called the Knights Academy, after your favorite piece." Ethan's eyes widened with surprise and joy. "So that's amazing," he said. Mr. Carter smiled proudly, unable to speak. From that moment, plans began. Construction started within weeks. Richard personally oversaw everything. Classrooms, a library, a small chess hall, and computers for children who never had one before. The media covered it widely, calling Richard Moore the millionaire with a heart. But Richard didn't care about headlines anymore. He cared about the laughter of kids who finally had a chance. He often told reporters, "I'm not a hero. The real hero is a boy who reminded me to be human." Months later, the Knights Academy opened. The city mayor attended, along with teachers, children, and families from every background. Ethan stood beside Richard on stage, holding the microphone nervously. "I never thought playing chess would change so many lives," he said softly. The crowd clapped. Then Richard took the stage, speaking slowly and humbly. "Years ago, I laughed at a janitor's son because I thought I was smarter. That was the biggest mistake of my life. Today, I stand beside that same boy, my teacher, my friend, my inspiration." The entire hall went silent, touched by his honesty. Then came applause so loud that it filled the air like thunder. Richard looked at Ethan and smiled with pride. After the ceremony, they sat outside under a big tree near the academy. The night was quiet, the stars bright. "You changed me, Ethan," Richard said. "No, sir," Ethan replied softly. "You changed yourself." Richard chuckled. "Maybe, but you were the reason I started." Ethan smiled. Then we both won the game. That made Richard laugh for real, not the proud fake laugh he once had, but a warm, genuine one. As time went on, Ethan continued to rise in the chess world, representing his country in international tournaments, always carrying the same wooden chess set Richard had given him years ago. He never replaced it, no matter how many trophies he won. It reminded him of where he came from and who believed in him first. Richard, now older and wiser, often watched Ethan's matches on television, smiling proudly from his home office. He had retired from most of his businesses and dedicated his time fully to helping others. The Knights Academy grew into several branches across the country, touching thousands of lives. Every child who walked into those classrooms saw a picture on the wall, a photo of a young boy playing chess with a millionaire, both smiling. The caption read, "Never underestimate a small move." It can change the whole game. And though years passed, Richard never forgot that rainy morning when it all began. Sometimes he would visit the old company building, now quieter and humbler. The janitor there was new, but Richard would always stop and greet him respectfully. One day, a little boy mopping the floor asked curiously, "Sir, do you play chess?" Richard smiled gently and replied, "I used to, but now I just watch the masters." The boy grinned, not realizing who he was talking to. As Richard walked away, he felt peace, the kind that comes only when you've made things right. The man who once laughed out of pride now smiled out of gratitude. The man who once measured worth in gold now measured it in goodness. And somewhere deep in his heart he whispered, "Checkmate." Finally. Years passed, and time changed everything except the bond between Ethan and Mr. Richard Moore. The Knights Academy had become famous across the country, a place where hope lived in every child's eyes. Richard was now older, his hair grey, his voice softer, but his heart stronger than ever. Ethan had grown into a young man, calm, confident, and respected around the world as a chess champion and mentor. He traveled to many countries, winning tournaments and teaching kids that talent can come from anywhere. Yet no matter where he went, he always returned to the academy, the place that had started with a single promise and a single game. One afternoon, Ethan returned home after winning an international championship. The media waited outside, cheering his name, but he quietly slipped away and went straight to Richard's mansion. He found the old man sitting by the window, holding a chess piece, the same golden knight that had once belonged to Ethan. Richard looked up and smiled weakly. "So the champion returns," he said. Ethan grinned. "I couldn't have done it without you, sir." Richard chuckled. "Oh, I think you could have. You always had that spark. I just helped you see it." They sat together in silence for a while, watching the rain fall outside just like the day they had first met. After a moment, Richard said quietly, "Do you remember what I told you back then? That sometimes the smallest move changes everything." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. I think about it every day." Richard smiled faintly. "I'm glad, because that move, challenging you that day, was the best mistake I ever made." His eyes glistened with emotion. Ethan felt a lump in his throat but managed to smile. "You turned that mistake into something beautiful." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Maybe, but you gave it meaning. You showed me that greatness doesn't wear a suit. It wears humility." For a moment neither of them spoke. The sound of the rain filled the room like quiet music. Then Richard said softly, "Ethan, when I'm gone, promise me one thing. Keep the academy alive. Keep giving those kids a chance, just like I gave you." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I promise, sir." "You have my word." Richard nodded with peace in his heart. He placed the golden knight in Ethan's hand and said, "It belongs to you now." "You completed the set." Ethan wanted to protest, but Richard raised his hand. "It's time, son." That night, the rain kept falling and the world outside went quiet. A few days later, the news spread across the city. Mr. Richard Moore, the millionaire who once laughed at a janitor's son, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The entire city mourned him, not as a businessman, but as a man who changed countless lives. At his funeral, hundreds of children from the Knights Academy came holding small chess pieces in their hands, placing them gently by his grave. Ethan stood at the front, dressed in a black suit, holding the golden knight close to his chest. When it was his turn to speak, his voice trembled but stayed strong. "Mr. Moore taught me that life is like chess. It's not about how powerful your pieces are, it's about how you use them." He played his last game with kindness and left this world a winner. Everyone clapped softly, tears in their eyes. After the ceremony, Ethan visited the academy. He walked into the main hall where a new portrait hung on the wall, a painting of Richard smiling beside a young boy holding a chess set. Underneath it was a quote in golden letters. "True wealth is found in the lives you change." Ethan touched the frame gently and whispered, "Thank you, sir." From that day forward, Ethan took charge of the Knights Academy. He expanded it across the world, opening branches in poor villages and cities where children had no access to education. Every new building carried the same logo, a golden knight. Years went by and people began calling Ethan the Golden Knight, not just because of his chess skills, but because of his heart. One evening, years later, a little boy walked into the academy, shy and quiet. He watched others play chess but didn't dare to join. Ethan noticed him from across the hall and smiled. He walked over and asked, "Do you like chess?" The boy nodded nervously. "Yes, sir, but I'm not smart enough.